Merry Christmas to you, wherever you are. I'm Sloman, author of many a dark psychological tale, and also multiple finalists at the British Fantasy Awards. I'm delighted to be here today, reading as part of Lex Jones's Christmas Ghost Stories. And the story I'm going to be reading to you today is Dane's brilliant Six Geese A-Laying, which first appeared in 2017 in Dean M. Drinkle's anthology 12 Dark Days, A Hell of a Christmas. Now, before I start reading, for those of you who don't know Dane, and why don't you? But if you don't, Dane, the Goth Mother, is a UK-based author of dark fantasy and steampunk novels. With an Irish mother and Welsh father, Raven's a true child of the Celtic twilight. She started her career writing as a journalist for UK national magazines, but the fiction bug hit her back in the 90s and she moved into writing novels. She's contributed stories to the Doctor Who spin-off film White Witch of Devil's End, and she's also won the inaugural VSS steampunk novel of 2011 with Sirius Darien and the Technomicron. So, a brilliant author too, for me to be able to read. Without further ado, I shall begin. Six Geese A-Laying. London, December 1765. They called him Lucky Jack. It wasn't his real name, no one knew what that was, and he didn't believe in luck. Any good fortune that came his way was due to his cunning, careful planning and skill in extricating himself from potential danger. Slippery, skulking Jack would have been a better name. With any sign of a noonday sun hidden behind brooding snow clouds, he found shelter beneath a Tudor inn overhang, tucking himself well away from any cess chucked out from the overhead window onto the street. A good move. A steaming bucket full of piss and turds landed onto the street where he'd just stood. Lucky Jack indeed. Wet snow fell just before the arrival of the midday coach at the Pied Bull. The usual excitement on the streets subdued by a relentless snowfall, the first sharp sting from the oncoming winter. Unlucky indeed for the travel-exhausted passengers, most especially those paying a lesser fare and travelling on the exposed roof seats. Announced by the shrill call of a post horn muted by a deep growl of thunder, the coach arrived in a rumble of wheels and the clatter of iron-shod hooves slipping on the icy cobblestones. Clouds of steam arose from the four sweat-drenched coach horses, their heads drooping low, too tired to need anyone holding their bridles. Even a step forward from one of the lead horses would make the coach lurch forward, making it hazardous for its disembarking passengers. To Jack's relief, a man in a sodden, mud-caked livery stayed at the horses' heads and held the reins tightly. One less witness. Time to get to work. Jack made a rapid survey of the passengers. Most were returning Londoners for Christmas who purposely hurried out of the square, their servants waiting or the strongest porters for their gift-laden luggage chosen in advance. The newcomers were Jack's target, visitors who stood, legs unsteady from the cramped long journey, gazing around them confused and uncertain. With most of the passers-by gone from the square to find shelter from the strengthening wind and biting snowstorm, and the coach now gone, they were vulnerable. Standing in a huddle by their luggage in a strange city, prey for the taking. Not long now. Enduring the continued snowstorm, scraggy street urchins and scruffy gin-soaked chancers approached the weary travellers to offer their services as porters and guides. The passengers would not know who to trust and who were the rogues and thieves they had no doubt been warned about before their journey. Their fear and uncertainty was like music to Jack's ears. All was falling into place for him now. As expected, genuine porters now emerged from their shelter in nearby inns, and a fierce argument began between them and the opportunists. No one noticed smartly dressed Swift and Sneaky Jack stride through them, an expensive black leather portmanteau now tucked underneath his arm. His one set of Toft's expensive clothing had saved his neck being stretched many a time. Who would suspect a fine gent becoming a thief? He walked with a confident, nonchalant swagger away from the square, his loot in perfect keeping with his garb, and returned to his quarters in Limehouse, a cramped bottom-floor rented room under a brothel that he shared with his latest doxy. Couldn't even remember her name, just one of the interchangeable company and bed warmers rented from the madam upstairs. No one was there as he strode in. Good. Usually he emptied purses and bags of their contents in an alleyway before reaching home, took the coin and dumped the rest. Jewellery and fine silk kerchiefs could be traced back to their original owner. Coin was untraceable. Wise and wily Jack. Why he brought the portmanteau home was a mystery to himself. It went against all his own rules from a lifetime of successful thievery. a career that spanned most of his 56 years of London lowlife, from opportunist street urchin to skilled pickpocket and burglar. Look how he lived, a dry, cleanish room of his own, a choice of young women to bed without paying a penny. He was his own boss, answerable to no man or woman, and he never spent a night in jail. His attention went back to the bag. It was a fine thing, high-quality patent leather, polished to a mirror-like shine. Solid brass fittings gleamed in the dim light of one flickering tallow candle. There was considerable weight to its contents. There must be something worthwhile within. He tried to open it, but the catch would not prise apart. That was odd. It had no locking device, just two small intertwined brass knobs that should have sprung apart. Jack tried again, but gave up, exasperated, his fingers red and sore from the pressure. He flung the bag onto his narrow bed and pulled a bottle of cheap gin from underneath. Fortified by knocking back half of a bottle of the coarse throat-burning brew, he changed his mind about not damaging the bag and dug out some tools of the trade, a thin file and a small jemmy. Several frustrating minutes later he was convinced the bloody thing was indestructible. Even hammering the file into the opening with all his strength made no difference. Bruised, exhausted, frustrated, he threw the bag into a corner of his room and collapsed back onto his bed. He'd get the doxies to take it away and chuck it into the Thames later, where its considerable heaviness guaranteed it would sink to the bottom, along with the weighted dead bodies and wrecked barges. There was no way he was going to get caught with the wretched thing. Mary was her name, apparently, a slight girl with masses of unruly red hair and freckles, only been in London 6 months, and already the Irish country girl glow to her eyes and skin had gone along with any lingering innocence. She knew better to question Lucky Jack, never slow to raise a fist to an uppity wagtail. No point in complaining to the madam, Jack's sister, either. Mary was paid to endure whatever demand was made of her. Jack watched her leave, the bag wrapped in her shawl. He was overcome with a curious relief to see the back of it. Never a superstitious man, he couldn't shake off the sensation of wrongness about the thing's invulnerability to brute force. His curiosity towards the hidden contents remained, like an itch that carried on long after the flea had bit him. An hour later the girl walked back in, her shawl now on her head, soaking with yet more early snow, her face pinched from the cold. The bag had gone. She undressed quickly, hung her wet clothes over a chair by the fire and got into the bed beside him. Jack was a source of warmth, one he had no problem providing that night, still unsettled by the bag. "Is it done, girl? Did you chuck it in the river?" Still shivering, she attempted to smile and nodded. "Down by the grapes. Went down like a stone, sure it did." Shrugging, she added, "Bit of a waste, though. Nice bag like that. Could have fetched a good price." Jack grabbed her by the throat, hard. "Don't lie to me, you little bitch. Have you dumped it in the river?" Terrified and unable to breathe, she managed to nod her head. Releasing his grip, her hands went up to her bruised throat. "I swear, by Jesus, Mary and Joseph, I did what you asked. I waited until there was no one watching and only left when it was out of sight under the water." Jack's inexplicable unease about the portmanteau had turned to fear. It was an idiot to trust this little whore. He should have seen to the bag's disposal himself. He threw her out of his bed and ordered her out of his room, hardly giving her the time to gather up her sodden clothes, let alone get dressed. Restless with anxiety, back in his usual rough attire, he returned to the streets and walked down to the Thames. What was he expecting to find? Had she done her job, the bag would be at the bottom of the river, or taken with the tide down to the sea. But what if she fenced it? She had chosen a spot by the Grapes pub, plenty of customers willing to buy it off her there. It could be traceable back to him and a date with the hangman. He had to silence her that night. He awoke to a soft blue light glowing on his ceiling, snow and plenty of it overnight. His one small window was glazed with frost swirls and his room was as cold as a witch's tit. Cussing, he arose to light his one small fire when he saw a dark shape on the bed. Jack shrieked. The accursed black bag was soaking his bed sheets with filthy Thames water. The portmanteau itself was not wet, as if disdaining the real world, a baleful, unearthly thing to be feared. Fleeing the room, Jack ran out into the night, not stopping until he could no longer breathe, his chest crushed as if in a tightening vice. The cold woke him from his flight with an icy slap to his face. Unable to face going back, he found shelter in a livery stable, sleeping deep in a haystack for warmth. He arose before dawn and the arrival of the grooms coming to feed the horses. He felt something hard brushing his legs. With a groan of inevitability, it was the bag. The bag back under his arm, Jack's mind raced as he stumbled back to his room through the foot-deep snow. It had not returned to its original owner, but to the thief who stole it. All he needed was someone to steal it off him. He dressed quickly and returned to the street, trudging to the poorest and most disreputable part of the city, 7 Dials. He sat on the stone steps of an inn and, putting the bag behind him, made a show of lighting a clay pipe. Within a minute, the bag was gone. Let the bastard thing plague another thieving gutter snipe. Her silk dress, once a deep cherry red, was a tattered fading pink, the hem filthy from dragging along the London streets. Soaking now from the snow, Gloriana hoped the sparkling white covering that made even 7 Dials look beautiful would also clean her gown. She avoided her reflection in the shop windows, knowing full well what it would show. Her haggard looks made worse by thick white lead makeup and overdone rouge, her thinning lips coated with smeared carmine, her high pompadoured wig tousled and askew. Once a fêted and adored courtesan in Kensington with her own apartments, Glory could barely afford the rent in a shared room in a rancid slum. She hardly ate, her one good dress hanging off her now scrawny frame. In desperation she snatched the handsome leather bag from an unwary fool and ran back to her digs, praying it contained something of worth. With the bag's quality, that alone could fetch a pretty penny. She did not reach the squalid room she was forced to call home. Strong arms grabbed around her waist and she was dragged screaming into a narrow alley, dark as pitch despite the morning's bright glow, the sun dancing diamonds off the snow. With one hand gripping her throat, her assailant thrust the other under her dress. Knowing what was to come, Glory's tear-filled eyes looked to the snow beyond the alley, so beautiful, so pure. The man's rage at discovering the streetwalker's true gender was incendiary. He broke her neck and held her down in the filth. Taking the portmanteau, he strode away, still muttering curses. Ted Barnett's temper was legendary in the Dials, a hair-trigger response that could be set off by something as inconsequential as dogs growling at him, the canine instinct knowing he was a wrong 'un. Discovering that Hall was really a Molly had filled him with rage and disgust. He needed a drink, a great deal of drink, but had run out of money. The bag would be good for a bottle of rum or 2 of gin, so he made his way to the nearest pub. He'd been barred from every one in the Dials, so strode through the vile wet mush to Piccadilly. He found a gin house on the way to the more affluent area, but far enough from the depravity to be worth trying to trade. Though early in the morning the premises were full, the stench and miasma of cheap gin, stale sweat and tobacco as dense as London fog. He approached the owner and offered him the bag. As he expected, the man's eyes lit up as he felt the weight of the thing and the fine quality of the bag itself. Barnett strode out of the gin house with 2 good bottles of Dutch brew and headed home to get drunk and scour the memory of his encounter from his mind. Didn't reach home. The anger too great, he ducked into the wide doorway of a factory and opened the first bottle, downing most of it in a long gulp. The freezing temperatures forgotten as the gin spread false warmth through his stout body. Loud voices and heavy hands woke him from a drunken stupor. The factory owners had called for the Bow Street runners to evict the ne'er-do-well from their doorway. A wise move. Even falling down drunk, Barnett's aptitude for violence was considerable. As he staggered to his feet, he noticed a familiar sight beside him, the black bag. "Someone has been a busy boy this morning," said one of the runners, picking it up. "Exactly the same one as was nicked from the landlord of the Bell and Candle." He punched Barnett in the stomach. "And you matched the description given by the landlord, including the 2 stolen bottles of gin." Unable to gather a coherent or believable defence, Barnett was bundled off through the crowded streets to the Bow Street jail to jeers and pelted with rubbish both against him and the law enforcers. He was clapped in chains and manacles to a mildewed wall, dripping with water in a freezing cell and left alone. Doomed, his brutal persona began to unravel. This was so wrong. He'd meet his fate over the outright lies of that bastard landlord, not for the many he'd killed in fights over the years or the just dispatch of that Molly bitch. Barnett slumped to the ground, stone floor, with a handful of wet straw reeking of piss. Still heavily intoxicated, he drifted off to sleep, wondering if he'd get a merciful magistrate to sentence him to hard labour or transportation. Unlikely the value of the gin and the bag would lead him to the gallows at Tyburn, for certain. Jack's heart skipped more than one beat in fright. Blood froze in his veins. Mary, as dead as she was when he tipped her body into the Thames. Her flesh was grey, bloodless, her clothing soaked and filthy from the Thames water and silt, her eyes glazed over, sightless, the bruises around her throat where he had throttled her livid against the dead flesh pallor of her skin. She raised one hand and presented a large egg to him like a gift. Jack refused to go near her, shuddering with terror, a warm trickle of piss running down one leg. The spectre glided towards the table and put the egg on the table. Jack could not move, too traumatised by this. His fear-muddled mind could not frame an explanation. A hallucination, a waking bad dream, something in that bad gin. He'd finished the whole bottle by the end of the night. His hand trembling, he touched the egg with one finger. It was solid, cold, like stone, a goose egg by its size, shape and colour. What did this mean? He backed away from the table, from the horror still standing in his room. Her mouth opened, spilling out brown, stinking river water that pooled on the floor around her grey, bare feet. No sound came from that open mouth, no expression from her dead eyes. She raised one arm slowly, the dead weight hampering any supernatural animation. Mary Regan from Galway pointed to the egg. Cracks had appeared in the stone-like shell. Barnett awoke in his dank cell with his nostrils clogged with the heavy scent of cheap cologne. The stuff whores used to hide their unwashed body odour. Another prisoner? He glanced around the cell, lit only by the bright glow of the sun on the snow. Outside one high, small window with no glass but iron bars. No one was there, but the cologne reek had not disappeared. Barnett remembered the last time he had encountered such a scent, and it made him squirm with unease and disbelief. Before he could solve the mystery, 4 jailers arrived with a seedy-looking cleric clutching a tattered Bible, more to comfort him than the doomed prisoner. His time had come. The magistrate had shown no mercy and declared an example had to be made, and all the usual banalities to make him feel superior and just in murdering a man. In the shadows of an Essex market town, Gorgil, the demon who preferred to be known as Professor Titus Gander, tucked the black leather bag under his arm, its job done, for now. He walked to an abandoned slaughterhouse at the end of a narrow street and glided through the solid walls to his lair within. The decades-old spatter of dried animal blood on the floor and walls added to the charnel house's atmosphere of fear and panic, though that of animals was never enough for Gander's voracious appetite. He had no need for candles to light up the gloom. The brimstone blaze of his snake-like eyes was illumination enough. He put the bag on the rancid floor and stepped back as it opened wide. A sickly green miasma seeped out and formed into shadowy forms at his feet. They coalesced into the shapes of 6 hideous geese. Their black feathers pulsed with a baleful spectral light, an illusion, for they were also demonic entities, spawned to wreak harm on humans at Gander's whim. "Well done, my beauties," he crooned, caressing each bird as they stretched their long necks to reach his hand, their eyes flickering with flame, their bodies reeking of corruption and brimstone. 6 eggs, all in the hands of their victims. All would hatch today with dire consequences to the mole. He would feast well on their misery. The next morning, Gander adjusted his caped coat and tricorn hat and stepped back out into the frosty air. In the market square he saw the stagecoach readying to make the long journey to the heart of London. Once more he would ascend to an outlier seat. The freezing cold meant nothing to a being forged from hellfire. Once more he would appear vulnerable, ready to be careless with the portmanteau and its contents. 6 more cursed eggs. Christmas gifts from hell. That was 6 Geese a Laying by Dane. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Merry Christmas. Good night.